What if some of the healthiest, most delicious, and most unusual vegetables had disappeared from our table centuries ago? What if those forgotten plants grown by medieval farmers were actually much more natural, much more resilient, and perhaps even smarter versions of the things we chase today as superfoods? Come on, let us look together at these hidden treasures of the past. Because there were some plants cultivated by medieval people that today we have almost completely forgotten. And to be honest, that is a real loss. The first one is skirret. This was practically one of the star root vegetables of the Middle Ages, but over time it mysteriously disappeared from the radar of modern agriculture. Today, carrots that constantly need attention and care may be very popular, but skirret was a much less demanding crop. Once planted, it would quietly spread underground, creating its own little stock with almost no extra effort from the farmer. It was almost like a food pantry hidden beneath the earth. Something like a savings account working in the soil. It may not have suddenly given you a huge harvest, but it was regular, reliable, and deeply satisfying. What made skirret truly special was not only how easy it was to grow. Its taste was extraordinary too. It was naturally much sweeter than carrots or wild carrots. Its thin white roots were so delicious that even nobles took notice. Medieval aristocracy especially loved skirret. They wanted it grown in palace gardens. So this was no ordinary root vegetable. It was a royal favorite with quite a fan base. Another thing that made skirret valuable at the time was its reliability. While other crops failed in harsh winters, it continued to provide nourishment underground. Old agricultural texts describe it as a plant that brought comfort to the poor when the fields were empty. Perhaps its most impressive quality was its versatility in the kitchen. Medieval cooks fried skirret, boiled it, added it to stews, and even put it into sweet pies. Before potatoes arrived in Europe, it was almost like the Middle Ages potato. It was such a practical root that it practically deserved its own coat of arms. But at some point, this wonderful vegetable was forgotten. Modern agriculture turned toward larger, faster-growing roots, and skirret quietly left the stage. After skirret comes another plant, Alexander. This plant was highly respected in medieval gardens. In fact, the Romans were among the first to bring it to Britain, and medieval farmers loved it. But Alexander was not the kind of plant that preferred to sit quietly in garden rows. It grew more with the stubbornness of a weed, but with the elegance of a gourmet. It was like discovering that a neighbor who seems irritating is actually a fantastic cook. What made Alexander so remarkable was that nearly every part of it was edible. Its stems, leaves, flowers, roots, and seeds, all of them could be used in the kitchen. The young shoots were eaten like celery, the flowers were added to salads, and the seeds were ground as a substitute for pepper. The leaves gave soups and stews a flavor somewhere between parsley and celery, a little unusual, but a pleasant taste. The plant could grow nearly 2 meters tall, produce bright yellow flowers, and also attracted beneficial insects. It could grow on its own in coastal areas, rocky places, and along roadsides without any human help. In other words, it was the true freelancer of the plant world. It would show up uninvited but still be useful. Even so, Alexander gradually disappeared from the kitchen. By the 1700s, celery had taken its place in European gardens and on European tables. Today, most people who see it growing wild in nature do not know that it was once a valuable food source. As Alexander withdrew from the gardens, another medieval classic continued to exist in a quieter, but much more orderly way, Good King Henry. No one is entirely sure why this plant was given such a royal-sounding name, but it was a vegetable found almost everywhere in medieval Europe. It grew both wild in nature and in carefully tended gardens. What is more, it was extremely easy to grow. It almost grew by itself, came back every year, and never asked to be replanted. If plants had job applications, Good King Henry would definitely write, "extremely reliable," in the title. Its nutritional value was at a level that could impress even modern health experts. It contained more iron than spinach, and was also very rich in vitamin C. This was especially important during spring famines. In the Middle Ages, people struggled to find fresh greens at the end of winter, and early leaves were almost life-saving. It was also very useful in the kitchen. The young shoots were eaten like asparagus, the mature leaves were cooked like spinach, and the flower buds were used like little bits of broccoli. It was truly a 3-in-1 kitchen helper. Folk medicine also valued Good King Henry. Its leaves were used for wounds, while tea made from its roots was considered a mild laxative. In some regions, because of its versatility, it was called all good. As agriculture became more commercial, this humble but hardy plant was pushed off the stage. So, is this a root vegetable or an oyster? That is where salsify comes in. Medieval farmers looking at this strange root vegetable would not quite know what to think, because salsify had one of the most interesting flavors in the plant world. It was so unique that it seemed like a vegetable disguised as seafood. You could imagine it as someone at a costume party dressed as seafood and winning the prize for the most convincing costume. When cooked properly, it really does have a taste resembling oysters. That is why it was especially valuable for devout people who could not eat meat or fish on certain days. Monastic records from the 1400s show that salsify was used in place of fish during Lent. In medieval gardens there were two kinds, white salsify and black salsify. Both had long, slender roots, and the black skin had to be peeled before cooking. It was one of the best examples of why one should not judge something by appearance. Beneath an ugly exterior there was a gourmet flavor. Winter was the golden season for salsify. It was one of the rare fresh vegetables that could still be found in the coldest months. It could remain in frozen soil and be dug up whenever needed. After harvest, it could also keep for months without spoiling. In a world without refrigerators, this made it priceless. But modern agriculture abandoned it because it grew slowly and looked strange. Speaking of strange appearances, let us move on to another fruit that medieval people loved but that seems far too odd to the modern age, medlar. If someone handed you a wrinkled, soft fruit today, you would probably politely turn it down. But medieval people saw it as a delicacy patiently awaited. Medlar looks like a small brown apple. Its bottom is open and shows its 5 seeds. When freshly picked from the tree, it is rock hard, and so bitter that it cannot be eaten. But medieval gardeners knew its secret very well. Medlar had to be bled before it could be eaten. That basically means controlled decay. The fruit would be left for weeks, soften, and turn brown. Medieval ideas about dessert were truly different. They had a taste for something that required patience but rewarded you in the end. Properly bled medlar becomes like sweet, cinnamon-spiced apple puree inside. And medieval people loved it. Cookbooks from the 1200s contain many recipes for medlar pies, jellies, and wines. Unlike salsify, medlar did not hide its strangeness. On the contrary, it displayed it openly. The fruit's open bottom gave it some rather colorful nicknames in the Middle Ages. Let us just say most of them are too crude to repeat here. The medieval comparison clearly drifted toward an anatomical area, and it is probably best to leave it there. Medlar's defining trait was timing. It ripened in late autumn, and was one of the last fresh fruits before winter. After being bled, it could still last for a few more weeks, giving one of the rare sweets of the darkest days of the year. Modern agriculture, however, lost it to crops that grew faster and lasted longer. Today's consumers want products that look perfect immediately. Waiting weeks for something to become edible is not very appealing. Medlar was the fruit of patience, But the next forgotten green was the exact opposite. It was far too eager. Chickweed was a plant that asked for no special care, made no show of itself, but appeared everywhere. It had no grand cultivation plan, because it was already everywhere. With its tiny leaves and delicate white flowers, it would appear on its own in gardens, fields, and roadsides across medieval Europe. Chickweed was like that uninvited guest who shows up at every party, and then somehow makes everyone happy. Medieval gardeners could not send it an invitation, because they could not even stop it. It grew in every kind of soil, sprouted in every season above freezing, and a single plant could leave behind thousands of seeds. Rather than pulling it out as a weed, medieval people recognized its value and collected it as free food. Its soft leaves could be gathered year-round. What is more, fresh chickweed contained about 7 times more vitamin C than oranges of equal weight. If vegetables had job titles in the Middle Ages, chickweed would definitely be the royal vitamin C provider. Peasants used it in their daily meals, but records show that nobles also served chickweed when green vegetables became hard to find in winter. It also had medicinal uses. Because of its cooling effect, it was considered useful for skin irritation. Its tea was also given for fever and inflammation. Modern agriculture declared war on chickweed and labeled it a weed. But in reality, this plant was probably removed from the diet simply because it did not apply for the position of vegetable. While chickweed was fighting for recognition, another medieval vegetable was suffering because of its name. Scorzonera. Who would want to eat something like that? The name sounds like a disease, right? Like saying, I can't come to school today, I have a bad case of scorzonera. But this poorly named vegetable was an important part of medieval gardens. Its name comes from the Italian word scorzone, meaning venomous snake. Early healers believed that this black-skinned root could cure snake bites. Of course, that medicinal claim turned out not to be true. But medieval people discovered something more valuable. Scorzonera was really tasty and very nutritious. Scorzonera is often confused with black salsify, but although they are close relatives, there are differences between them. Scorzonera has a longer and straighter root. Its skin is black, its flesh white. Its taste is milder and sweeter than salsify, with notes reminiscent of asparagus and hazelnut. Another thing that made it special was its storage ability. Roots harvested in autumn could be buried in sand in a cool cellar and stay fresh until the following summer. Very few vegetables in the Middle Ages offered such strong food security. Cultivation records from the 1500s show that scorzonera was especially loved in monastery gardens. Monks valued it during fasting periods for both its taste and medicinal properties. Medieval doctors also recommended scorzonera tea for cleansing the blood and soothing the stomach. And one of the funniest things about growing scorzonera is the effect it has on neighbors. If you said, I'm going to gather some scorzonera, people might think you had an exotic sports car or that you were going off to perform magic. But once modern markets and refrigerators arrived, scorzonera's star faded. Once fresh produce became available year-round, vegetables that needed long storage lost their appeal. Scorzonera, transformed from snake remedy into forgotten root, was overshadowed by more familiar vegetables. Another confusing plant was Welsh onions. Because of the name, it is very normal to think of Wales, but it comes neither from Wales nor is it really an onion. It looks like a vegetable suffering from an identity crisis. Yet this seemingly fake plant was actually very valuable in medieval horticulture. Its origin lies in East Asia, and it most likely reached Europe through trade routes in the 1200s. Medieval farmers loved it because it was a versatile plant that produced crops every year. Once planted, it came back without needing replanting, spread in clumps, and formed a structure that could be divided over time. One medieval gardening text says that a single Welsh onion plant, if repeatedly divided, could feed a family for 10 years. This plant served a completely practical purpose. It provided fresh green onions whenever other vegetables were running low. Medieval cooks used the hollow green stems to add flavor to soups, stews, and salads. Its most important trait was its winter hardiness. In many parts of Europe, it stayed green except in the harshest winters. So it supplied vitamins when people needed them most and never let them down. Welsh onions really seemed to solve a strange identity crisis perfectly. Neither Welsh nor fully an onion, but perfect exactly as it was. Modern agriculture, however, turned toward larger-headed true onions, and this modest plant was left in the background. Unlike Welsh onions, another plant was found everywhere in the Middle Ages even though it was never cultivated at all: fat hen. This wild green would appear on its own in fields, gardens, and empty plots across Europe. People did not pull it out, but rather learned to eat it. Because fat hen was one of those surprising guests who arrives uninvited and still contributes to the kitchen. It entered the garden without permission, but everyone forgave it because of its nutritional value. Recent studies have also shown just how nutritious this wheat is. Fat hen contains more protein than cabbage, more iron than spinach, and more calcium than kale. If there had been a medieval nutritionist, this plant would have been declared a superfood outright. It is said that its name comes from its usefulness as chicken feed. Chickens that ate fat hen laid more eggs and grew plumper. So for the people of the time, it was almost an indirect source of prosperity. If medieval vegetables had slogans, this plant's slogan would surely have been, "Good enough for your chickens, even better for you." Archaeological digs have found countless fat hen seeds in food waste pits. This shows that it was regularly eaten during times of scarcity. Although cooking methods vary across Europe, the leaves were generally boiled like spinach or added to salads. Its seeds were also used to make flour in hard times. Modern agriculture declared war on fat hen. It saw it as a rival to crops. Yet in reality, we removed a superfood from our diet simply because it did not apply to be a vegetable. While fat hen was fighting for recognition, another plant was trying to keep its place in the kitchen: lovage. This was a medieval favorite that could flavor almost anything, and yet somehow ended up forgotten. As Roman soldiers conquered Europe, they carried lovage seeds with them and planted them wherever they went. Medieval monks continued this tradition and made sure that every monastery garden had at least one lovage plant. Its flavor is extremely strong. It can be thought of as celery and parsley turned up 10 times. Lovage is basically superpowered celery. Medieval cooks used it generously. One single stem could be enough to flavor an entire pot of soup. Dried leaves were sprinkled on meat dishes, seeds were ground for bread, and even the roots were boiled and eaten like wild carrots. But what made lovage especially valuable was its medicinal use. The whole plant contains oils that aid digestion, reduce bloating, and have a mild diuretic effect. Monastic records from the 13th century recommend lovage tea for stomach and kidney problems. A lovage plant can live for 20 years and grow over 2 meters tall. It is an incredible plant that takes up very little space while providing enormous aroma. It withstands harsh winters and returns stronger every spring. Medieval gardeners would probably think we have our heads elsewhere today. We gave up a plant that lives for decades, helps digestion, and flavors everything. What did we replace it with? Turnips? As new spices arrived through international trade, lovage gradually lost importance. As it disappeared, another green plant also struggled because of a very confusing name: corn salad. Yes, despite the name, it has nothing to do with corn. In fact, it is a plant that has been the victim of misunderstanding for centuries. While lovage faded into obscurity, corn salad was damaged entirely by its name. It gets its name because it often grows wild in grain fields. Before the word corn came to mean maize in Europe after its arrival from the Americas, it was used for grain. These small, delicate greens would emerge on their own after harvest in autumn and remain green throughout the winter. It was like a quiet student who is ignored because of a strange nickname, but is actually quite interesting. Medieval farmers discovered that these wild winter greens were not only edible, but also tasty. Corn salad has a light, slightly nutty flavor and lacks the bitterness found in many wild plants. Its leaves could be harvested even in the coldest months. Its nutritional value was also quite high. It offered a profile impressive enough to modern experts. It contained 3 times more omega-3 fatty acids than iceberg lettuce and provided significant amounts of iron and vitamin C. Medieval people regarded it as a true winter vegetable. Corn salad may be the only vegetable that suffered from both an identity crisis and an image problem. If it had had a marketing team, it would definitely have had to explain, "It does not contain corn." Modern agriculture preferred lettuces with longer shelf life and easier harvesting. Corn salad disappeared from the gardens. Another powerfully aromatic plant that vanished from the gardens was tansy. This plant was far too strong for modern tastes, and that is why it was largely forgotten. Yet medieval cooks loved it. Tansy was a perennial plant with fern-like leaves and bright yellow flowers. Every part of it carried a strong aromatic impact. It offered a complex mix of bitter, spicy, and slightly sweet notes. Modern analyses show that tansy leaves contain more than 40 aromatic compounds. If herbs were a rock band, tansy would definitely be the kind so loud that the neighbors would call the police. Medieval recipe books used tansy in many dishes, from sweet to savory. Easter tansy pudding was made by mixing chopped leaves with eggs, cream, breadcrumbs, and sugar, then frying the mixture. Tansy-flavored cheese was popular in spring celebrations. Even beer was sometimes flavored with tansy on special occasions. Beyond its strong taste, the plant also had a practical function. It acted like a natural preservative, extending the shelf life of meats and baked goods. That was a huge advantage in an age without refrigerators. It was also used in medicine. Tansy tea was given for intestinal parasites, digestive problems, and fever. It always had a place in monastery gardens, and it was planted near doors because it was believed that its smell kept flies away. Modern chefs would probably describe it as overly aromatic. Its medieval equivalent was like writing all the spices in capital letters. As milder herbs became more popular, tansy disappeared from kitchens. While tansy was forgotten for being too strong, another vegetable was forgotten for the exact opposite reason. It was too easy. Sea kale, or sea cabbage, was a highly valued plant that grew along the coasts of northern Europe. It thrived in sandy, salty soil and survived where other plants could not. It was like that friend who always shows up to a gathering uninvited, but still brings food and somehow remains everyone's favorite. Medieval people harvested sea kale in 2 ways. In spring, as blanched young shoots, like asparagus, and later as mature leaves cooked like cabbage. Unlike most wild foods, its taste was light and sweet. Its most important trait was its vitamin C content. It could be said to contain 6 times more vitamin C by weight than lemons. For fishing communities, it was an important food that helped prevent scurvy. To forget sea kale was like ignoring money lying on the ground. It was standing on the shore, nutritious and delicious, but we walked past it without looking. While sea kale was being forgotten, another plant was living with 2 identities at once: woad. This is a very strange plant indeed, because it was mainly grown to make blue dye, but medieval people also ate it. The blue pigment extracted from woad leaves was used to color clothing and war paint. Blue dye was almost impossible to find at the time, which made woad extremely valuable. but its young leaves could be eaten before the dye compounds developed. They were used in spring salads and soups. The taste was mild and a little peppery. Growing woad was not very pleasant, because the leaves were fermented for dye production and produced a very bad smell. It was so bad that royal decrees sometimes banned it from being grown near important places. In other words, it was the kind of plant that could stink up medieval kitchens for days. While woad struggled with its two identities, another vegetable was having an equally overlooked part: turnip greens. We all know turnips for their roots, but medieval farmers valued the leaves just as much. That is like using a smartphone only as a watch. You are missing its best feature. Turnip greens contained 4 times more calcium, 3 times more vitamin A, and twice as much protein as the roots. Peasants would harvest the outer leaves without harming the growing root, and use them in soups, stews, and salads. Their mildly peppery taste added flavor to winter dishes. Turnip greens deserve to be appreciated again, because they are like a real star who has been kept in the background for too long. While the roots got all the attention, these leaves kept on nourishing quietly. In the world of roots, leaves, and forgotten vegetables, these 15 neglected plants, from skirret to turnip greens, show us how much of our ancestors' nutritional wisdom we have lost. Maybe some of the things we chase today as new are actually very old. Maybe those humble plants growing in the gardens of the past were the smartest guests at our tables.